Hello and welcome to the UK Visas and Immigration webinar. Today's webinar is going to be focused on overseas domestic workers in private households. We'll be covering the eligibility, the documentary evidence required for an application, and also some of the care rights for domestic workers in the UK. And the presentation will be about 10 minutes long. So let's begin the presentation. First of all, what is an overseas domestic worker? You can apply for a visa to visit the UK with your employer if you are a domestic worker in a private household, have worked for your employer for at least 1 year, are from outside the European Economic Area and Switzerland, and meet other eligibility requirements, which we will cover shortly. Domestic workers' activities and duties include cleaners, chauffeurs, cooks, those providing personal care for the employer and their family, and nannies. So what can you and you cannot do? You can use this visa to visit the UK with your employer for up to 6 months. You must return home at the end of the 6 months or when your employer returns home, whichever of these is sooner. You can travel abroad and return to the UK to complete your stay, though you must prove that you're still working for your employer. So we'd recommend that you carry a letter from your employer with contact details should the immigration officer have any further questions they wish to ask. You cannot change your job or employer whilst you're in the UK. You cannot live in the UK for long periods of time through frequent visits. You cannot bring in family members, what we call dependents. You cannot switch to another type of visa from the current visa you're on. And you cannot receive or claim public funds. So eligibility. You must prove as a domestic worker that you are between 18 and 65 years old, that you've worked for your employer for at least 1 year, that you work in the same household as your employer or one that they use regularly, that you plan to travel to the UK with your employer, their partner or children, and that you intend to work as a full-time domestic worker in a UK household your employer will live in. You must plan to leave the UK at the end of 6 months or at the same time as your employer, again, whichever one of these is sooner, and that you're able to support yourself in the UK without the need for public funds. Your employer must be either a British or European Economic Area national who usually lives outside the UK and who doesn't intend to remain in the UK for more than 6 months. Or the employer can be a foreign national who is coming to the UK on a visit and who does not intend to remain in the UK for more than 6 months. For all of these, your employer must pay you at least the national minimum wage in the UK at the time of your stay. Please refer to the gov.uk website, and on this website visit the national minimum wage page for up-to-date details on the minimum wage at the time of application and throughout your stay. This is very important and it does change from time to time, so it's worth checking. So let's move on to supporting documentation that's needed for your application for your visa. When you apply, you will need to provide a current valid passport or other valid travel identification document, one passport-sized colour photo, proof that you can support yourself during your stay, for example bank statements or pay slips for, say, example, the last 6 months to show that you've had an income, and details of where you'll be staying and your return travel booking. You will need to have a blank page in your passport for UKVI to insert your visa once it's issued, so please do check your passport before submission. Moving on to more supporting documentation. This relates more to the employer in their preparation of your contract. So we require a letter from your employer confirming that you've worked for them in the same job for at least 1 year, 12 months. A completed and signed statement of your terms and conditions of employment showing that your employer will pay you at least a national minimum wage while you're working for them in the UK. And an additional statement from your employer confirming that they will not use any exemptions to avoid paying you the national minimum wage while you're working in the UK. Now please note that this contract and these documents I've just mentioned relate specifically to the UK employment during your 6-month stay. It's not about your employment at the moment in your home country. It's purely relating to the UK employment conditions and immigration rules. In addition, you can download the contract off the UK Visas and Immigration website. And if you navigate through the website, you'll be able to find this. In addition, you must also provide, as a domestic worker, one of the following documents covering the same period of your employment. So you can provide either pay slips or bank statements showing payment of salary, confirmation of tax paid, confirmation of health insurances that have been paid, contract of employment, work visas, residence permits, or equivalent passport endorsements for the country where you're currently employed by your employer, or visas or equivalent passport endorsements if you've travelled with your employer before. You may need to provide additional documents at a later stage once your application is submitted. However, you will be contacted at the time if this is the case by the visa officer and clear explanation of what they require. And please note as well that if the documents are not in English or Welsh, you will need to get a certified translation. So let's look at the domestic workers' rights. When a domestic worker is in the UK, your employer must pay you an agreed rate, which must be at least the national minimum wage as we discussed. And that can be checked again on the gov.uk website under the minimum wage payments. They must not force you to work excessive hours. They must give you agreed holiday pay, and they must give you notice you're entitled to if your employment ends or finishes. You should already have agreed your employment conditions with your employer and have a copy of this contract in writing, and your employer cannot change your employment conditions in the UK unless you specifically agree. If your employer doesn't meet these requirements, you can take legal action through an employment or industrial tribunal or the civil courts. So you have all your documents ready now. You're ready to make your application. The application form is completed online. You make your appointment online and you pay for your visa online. You then go to your visa application centre and submit your documents to the officer. They will then take your fingerprints and a facial photo, and in some instances there might be a short interview that's required. The application is then sent to the UK Visas and Immigration Visa Office, where a decision is made and hopefully your visa is issued, which means it will be endorsed in your passport, allowing you to travel to the UK. Unfortunately, sometimes applications are refused, in which case you'll receive your passport with a detailed refusal notice explaining the reason for the refusal. And to finish off, we'd just like to go through a little bit about the domestic workers' rights and care for them whilst they're in the UK, should any abuse happen. So just to summarise, modern slavery encompasses slavery, servitude, forced and compulsory labour and human trafficking. Traffickers and employers, some traffickers and employers, deceive and force individuals against their will into a life of abuse, servitude and inhuman treatment. So some of these covered are pay. You should be paid regularly. You should receive regular accounts or wages like pay slips, and you should be given an opportunity to send remittances or some of your pay back home if you choose to do so. Accommodation. Accommodation, if provided, should be clean and habitable, with adequate lighting, ventilation and temperature control. Sanitary and laundry facilities should be provided. And you are entitled to a room that you can occupy yourself with adequate bathroom facilities available for your use. Medical care. Your employer should provide appropriate medical insurance in the event of an injury in the UK, and access to medical treatment should never be withheld by an employer. Now, if you do feel that you're being exploited and you want to talk to somebody about it, there are various sources that you can contact. The first being the United Kingdom Police Force. You can dial 101 for slavery or 999 for any other kind of emergency related inquiry. Modern Slavery Helpline, you can contact them by phone on 0800 0121 700 or the website address as shown. In addition, there's a Citizens Advice Organisation. Again, the link is shown on the slide. And the Salvation Army also has a confidential helpline for victims of human trafficking. And please dial in such circumstances 0300 0038 151. The helpline is open 24 hours a day. So, hopefully that has given you a good overview of the requirements required to ensure that you're eligible as a domestic worker, confirms for the employer what is expected of the contractual conditions for the employer, and also the care of the domestic worker in the UK. If you do require any further information, then we would strongly encourage you to look at the gov.uk website under Visas and Immigration, where there is a wealth of information and also further clarification of what we have discussed today. So thank you very much for dialing in, and we hope you have a pleasant stay in the United Kingdom. Goodbye.